How long have you been at the Abbey? 5 days. And how many days left? This is the last full day. Okay. So how do you feel about that? Yeah, this is a bit of a tricky question. How do you feel about that? Unattached. Well played. Oh, goodness. So, I thought maybe I would briefly introduce myself, and then maybe we could go around and do a round of introductions. Does that sound good? So, my name is Russell. I just finished my 25th year as faculty in the psychology department at Eastern Washington University. So I've been around for a while and probably have been connected to the Abbey in some sort of shape or form for maybe 15 years, 10, 15 years, something like this. Yeah. And so my focus is an area of psychology called compassion-focused therapy. And it's a model that draws from various bodies of science. So we draw from evolution science and affective neuroscience, the neuroscience of how emotions work in the brain, the science of attachment and human relationships, and we also draw from Buddhist psychology approaches. So I think we're not a Buddhist therapy model per se, but there's a lot of adjacent aspects to CFT and particularly Tibetan Buddhist practice. So for me, it was actually Tibetan Buddhist practice that led me to compassion-focused therapy. I had done sort of 3 years of pretty intensive Tibetan Buddhist practice, lots of many hours practicing and lots of books read and retreats attended and things like this. And after about 3 years, I had noticed that my life had sort of changed in all the ways I'd hoped it would. And when I reflected on that, I noticed it was the compassion practices really that were the most, I guess, felt like the most powerful ones for me. So I started thinking, well, maybe we should use this in psychology, right? And I started looking for people who had done that, and that led me to compassion and compassion-focused therapy. But anyway, I'm a university professor. I've lived in Spokane for several years and lived a bunch of places before that. And maybe we could go around and if you could just tell me who you are, where you're from, and kind of what you're doing in life and what brought you to the Abbey. Does that sound all right? You want to start? Oh, we have a mic to pass even.
Yeah, there's a person who's attending online. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cheers.
My name's Jason. I've been living at the Abbey for 2 months now. I am of a 6-month stay. I'm really into Tibetan Buddhism, and I'd like to become a monastic. So, yeah.
Very cool.
What were the questions?
Yeah, I think you answered them. Yeah,
okay,
and it's
good.
Jason?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, I am Brooke. I'm originally from Texas, and I'm just traveling around.
Whereabouts in Texas?
Houston, originally.
Houston. I did most of my growing up in Oklahoma.
Oh, okay.
So.
Lots of people. Oklahoma has been brought up many times.
Really?
Recently on this retreat. It's like the whole time.
Really?
Yeah.
That's very strange.
Yeah.
Brianna from Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm just here for a transition in between jobs and stuff like that. So
cool.
My name's Asim. I'm from Texas as well, Dallas area, and I was here mostly I was like, how else would I spend my time? It seems like a pretty good use, and also to kind of meet other people who are interested in Buddhism in my age.
Nice, thank you.
Hi, I'm Kailea. I'm from Tri-Cities, Washington. I am a teacher-ish at a small alternative high school, and came to the Abbey in need of a break from my students. What brought me to the Abbey was friends who had recommended the Dharma to me, and just like a journey for self-discovery. And yeah, as an ex-Christian, this was something that was very profound and new to me. So.
Hi, my name is Josie, and I live in Seattle, and I'm a software engineer. Came to the Abbey because I was like feeling very burnt out about my work and that it didn't super align with my values, and that I just realized that there's so much that like your mind is so powerful, and a lot of the situations that we create are just things that we created in our minds.
Yeah.
So I think being here kind of has brought me a lot of like structure to things that I was thinking about for a while. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Josie.
Hello, I'm Hong Yi. I'm originally from Singapore, and I now work in Seattle, Washington. And the reason I came is that it seemed like a good thing to do since I was in Washington, and I felt like a connection to this abbey. And also have been exploring Buddhism in like a casual way as I was growing up in Singapore and throughout my young adulthood. And I totally agree with Josie about it being structure to a lot of my questions and thoughts about the world.
Nice, nice. I am aware that those of us who are in Washington State are quite privileged to have the Abbey right here. It's a very, I don't take it for granted at all.
My name's Tristan, and I'm coming from Seattle. And I also would really like to not take it for granted that the Abbey's here.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to do that. But I originally was drawn here by my interest in interactions, how to kindly interact with myself and others, and kind of break the reactive habits that I have. Cultivate something more full.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that fits with what we'll be talking about today. We have, a couple of folks in back there, too.
Hi, I'm Matt, and I'm here from Sandpoint, Idaho, because my daughter has been staying here, and I'm picking her up, and she invited me to come to this
cool
talk.
Welcome.
Thanks. This is my first time to the Abbey.
Yeah.
I'm Ada. This is my dad. And I first came to the Abbey last year because I'm from Sandpoint, and why not? It seemed like too much of a coincidence and too lucky to not take advantage of it.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, and thanks for joining, Dad. I'm feeling my fatherhood status a lot right now. My son's 18, and he just graduated from high school, so he's going to be off to Western Washington University in the fall, and so I'm starting to think about what that means for our whole family. Now that the configuration of things is shifting. So, what did you hope to get by coming here? You should know I'm a college professor, so I can start talking at any point and literally never stop. But I don't know if I don't know if today I feel like that's the way I'd like things to go. I'm sure I'll do quite a lot of talking. But when you came to the Abbey, or as you're sitting here, right? What would you hope to gain or to leave with? Some of you mentioned like how you understand or how you work with yourself when you're struggling or other things. But what are some things that, like if you could leave this experience with something that might be really helpful for you, what might that look like?
Well, first and foremost, I think I really appreciate you being here. And as I was going through kind of the teachings of the Buddha during this retreat, something that's been on my mind a lot is how a lot of these practices are so useful in terms of positive psychology. And it's amazing to know that you have an anger workbook, and even I think Venerable Chodron has a book about anger, and in the appendix you see all these strategies that you can use to deal with and cope with anger, which I find myself definitely could have benefited from now, or when I was in college and so on. And I'm curious, the question is coming, if you've used these, or if you've known people who have used this in like therapeutic practice or clinical psychology. And I say this because I've gone to therapy and they gave me these worksheets about like, how to ground yourself, like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, cognitive behavioral therapy. And I mean, a lot of meditation feels like cognitive behavioral therapy, or you could put it the other way around. Cognitive behavioral therapy feels like a sort of meditation, however you want to frame it. So I just feel like there are all these good tools that we now see, used in clinical practice. And I think a lot of these tools that we're learning now could very much be used in clinical practice. I'm curious if there's something you've thought about, have explored, know others who are working on this, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that if you look at various areas of psychology, you'll find that. You'll find the reflections of some of what you're learning here in the way those different aspects of therapy are applied. But there's some trickiness to that in that, the tradition is different. So the reason I started looking for, the things that led me to compassion-focused therapy is that, I'm no great scientist, but I'm enough of a scientist to feel kind of uncomfortable as a psychologist, reaching into a spiritual tradition and plucking out practices and just plopping them down in the therapy room. Right? Oh, those seem to work over here. Let's drop them over here. In fact, there's been actually a lot of, I think controversy is too strong a word, but a lot of criticism of how mindfulness has been westernized, right? And the idea that you lose something when you pull a practice or a technique out of a spiritual context and just sort of drop it into a secular context without really paying mind to the function of those practices and what they were developed to design. That said, there's certainly a whole lot that Western psychology can learn from Buddhist practice, and I think in compassion-focused therapy, we do a lot of that, mostly because many of us are practicing Buddhists or have been practicing Buddhists, and so that's sort of infused itself. But the difference is that when we start to do that, we need to understand how those things work in the context of science. And they need to be researched and studied in those sorts of ways. And so there's some trickiness that comes just because they're different traditions. Does that sort of make sense? Go for it, yeah.
So the whole mindfulness, there's some criticism. I mean, one thought is maybe if it's a beneficial practice. So I'm not sure how it works in like clinical psychology. I'm not a psychologist. Disclaimer, I work in tech. And so like, I guess in my head, I wonder what if, in the same way, I know a lot of there are like trials where you I know there are like journaling trials. I've read a lot of research papers about journaling.
Yeah. Clinical trials to demonstrate things work, yeah.
Yeah, and so suppose you're like, in the same way, you come up with a journaling protocol, and then you test it on like 15 college students and batches of them. And then maybe a protocol that is inspired, and exactly, you probably wouldn't put for instance, the anger workbook that Venerable Chodron wrote, which honestly, I think a lot of it doesn't come off very strongly as being like necessarily Buddhist spiritual either. And then, design a protocol, test it on like 15 college students, do batches. I'm not sure if this is the process in which that could gain credibility in the scientific space and then lead to greater clinical practice. I ask this because it just seems a bit sad that we get to enjoy this. And now I'm like, oh, it'd be so nice if my other friends in college and so on. And we only have 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and cognitive behavioral therapy, which is good, but insufficient.
I actually think that that's changing quite dramatically. I think if you look at various areas of psychotherapy, what you're going to find is that a lot of these ideas you're talking about have been incorporated, and we're actually doing exactly what you're describing. So, for example, I mean, compassion-focused therapy, very Buddhist adjacent. There's a model of a therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, which the core of acceptance of commitment therapy is accepting suffering and discomfort and then committing yourself to valued action, taking your life in the direction of the life you want to have, which again is very sort of influenced the way, in fact, I'm somewhat critical of that therapy in some ways, because I think some of them don't recognize the extent to which they have been influenced by the one, not the originators, but people understand how closely their ideas reflect Buddhist ideas. So, for example, when they talk about the notion of the self in that model of therapy, they use the term self as context. But basically what it means is awareness. The only thing we can identify as the self are these awareness processes where things pass in and out of awareness, that ability of us to be aware, to experience, which, yeah, right? I wonder where those ideas came from. So I think my short answer to your question is I think that's actually happening. But it's a sort of a slow process, and it should be a slow process because we need to be thoughtful about sort of what we roll out when we say this is going to help you. If you're struggling with that, we need to know that to be true. We need to have evidence around that, and we need to have developed it in the context in which we're using it, right? Not just plug and play, because that's not how it works. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi. Okay, I studied at Whitman College and was going to be a psychologist, and then they asked me to create a clinical study, and I was like, no, that's a lot of work. So I decided to do Spanish instead. Yeah. But one of the biggest things that I feel like a lot of us have been talking about is like attachment theory and the notion of attachment as like the source of all suffering within Buddhism.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering if you, like, what your thoughts on Piaget's theory compared to Buddhist notions of attachment. Like, what correlations do you see? What is your experience?
So I think that the psychologists and Buddhists use the word attachment in entirely different ways. So I actually don't see a whole lot of parallel there. I think we're just using the same word in different ways. There's some similarity, I guess. When the Buddhist version of me talks about attachment, I think of it in terms of clinging, in terms of I can't be happy unless I have this, right? When I think of attachment as a source of suffering in a Buddhist context, it's based in these ideas. This is what I need. If I don't have that, it's awful. The psychologist version of me, which is the one I inhabit, about 80% of the time in my life, when I talk about attachment, I'm talking about processes around us feeling connected with other human beings, primarily animals as well, but that sense of feeling connected and what happens in the brain when we do that. So one of the things I'll spend some time talking about today are different emotion regulation systems, how our emotions work, how they evolved. And one of the things that's really important to recognize about human beings, if you're going to be able to help them, is that we evolved primarily to feel safe through connection, through experiences of caring connection. And if we have those experiences, particularly early in life, as the attachment theorists talk about, that sets us up to relate to the world in certain helpful ways. And if we don't have that sort of stability of connection early in life, it sets us up to struggle in various ways in terms of, can we ask for help when we need it? Can we feel safe in connection with others, right? Do we feel like we're worthy of being treated with kindness and love, right? About 60% of the population who are what we might call securely attached, right? Who, when they were infants during those first couple years of life, when they would exhibit a distress call, when they would cry, their caregivers would consistently respond with nurturing. And when that happens for a human being over those first couple years, you learn a lot, right? You learn that help is there if you need it. You learn that uncomfortable experiences are scary, but they can be soothed through connection. You learn a little bit about what compassion looks like implicitly as others are treating you that way, as others are caregiving for you. You learn what that looks like, and it sets you up to be better at giving that to others. And you learn to experience yourself as a being that's worthy of love and being cared about because you're getting it, you're seeing it in real time, right? And so as you develop, those securely attached folk, tend to feel comfortable in relationship with others. They tend to feel more comfortable asking for help when they need it. They have this, and when difficult emotions come up in them, they're still uncomfortable, but they don't freak out because they understand, oh, I can do things about this. I can go talk to mom. I can do something and I can be soothed. And they even have mental representations of that connection that can help them sort of regulate emotions on their own, right? People who don't have that experience, and there are different ways that can play out. So for example, some people have what we might call an anxious attachment style. And the way you get that is by having a caregiver who's sometimes helpful but is inconsistent, right? Sometimes they show up in helpful ways, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they show up and they want to help, but then they get dysregulated and make it about them. And it's unhelpful, and now instead of just having this problem, you've got to deal with this dysregulated parent too, right? Sometimes they're there and then they disappear right when you need them the most. So folks with anxious attachment crave it. They crave connection. They want closeness, but they can't trust it. It's very hard for them to feel safe in relationship to others because they've learned it can disappear like that, right? And so for those folks, there's a lot more struggle around relations. They also, having had that experience of having caregivers disappear unpredictably, many of them will have an internalized sense of there's something wrong with me. If you really knew what I was like, if you really saw the real me, you wouldn't want me, you'd disappear. Because that's what their experience has taught them, right? We've got another group of folks that we might talk about as avoidantly attached, right? These are folks who tended to be isolated during their formative years. When they would, this is the, back in the 60s, there were some, I think 50s or 60s, there were some behaviorists that said, if you want your baby to stop crying, if your baby cries all the time, just let them cry it out. Just ignore it. They'll stop. Well, if you ignore a crying baby, it will stop crying eventually. But that's the worst possible thing you can ever do in relation to a baby. And the reason I say that is ask yourself, why does the unnurtured baby stop crying? It stops crying because it knows it doesn't help. No help will come. And ask yourself, what can a baby do when it's scared or uncomfortable or hungry or in need of help? What can a baby do? It can cry. It can do this one thing. So when we ignore that crying baby, we take away the functionality of the one thing it can do to help itself. And so when a baby has that experience time and again, that person learns help isn't there, right? It doesn't matter. Other people aren't helpful, right? Why should you care about other people? They don't care about you. They also tend to avoid relationships because they haven't learned to value them. They haven't learned that they're useful. They also tend to avoid their own emotions because those threat emotions were overwhelming to them because they were never soothed, right? If they would be scared or upset about something, that would stew in them, that would build in them, but there was never any experience of someone coming in and connecting and soothing and nurturing. So emotions become very scary things that you want to avoid. So what you can end up with, have you heard the phrase, if you can't beat them, join them? That's not really how humans work. It's more, we're actually wired to connect. That's how we're designed to soothe. That's how we're designed to feel safe. So I think it's more, if you can't join them, beat them. If we can't feel safe with others, then we're likely to resort to dominance maintenance strategies to regulate threat. If I can't feel safe through connecting with you, then I'll try to feel a little less threatened by having more power than you, more money, more guns, more whatever. Right? That's all threat regulation. And if you look at it in the culture, it is not very hard. I'm not going to name names here because I'm on video. But it's not very hard to find people whose entire lives are structured around competitive efforts to have more power, more influence, more money, Why do people do that? Well, we do that when we don't feel safe with, right? When we don't feel safe through connection, we resort to dominance striving. If I can't feel safe with you, better I have more power than you. And so that's what psychologists mean when we talk about attachment, right? Those are the sorts of dynamics we're talking about, which I think are in some ways, maybe anecdotally to Buddhist notions of attachment, but more linked by the word than anything else, right? And if you learned, words are what? Words are just symbols, right? They're placeholders for something else. So, great questions. So, do any of you? Let's do. I want to start with a little exercise. Because some of you have talked about relationship to yourself. So this is sort of that's something we spend a lot of time thinking about in compassion-focused therapy. So I want you to imagine a child. I want you to imagine a child that you love very much. Maybe this is your child, your theoretical child, or it's a sibling, a friend's child, a neighbor. But this is a kid that you really love and you care about and you want to have a good life, right? And imagine that this child is learning like a really difficult task, like to play a musical instrument, or does anyone play tennis? How many tennis players in here? We got a couple tennis players. Tennis is hard. It's difficult. And if you watch tennis and you think that looks really hard, no, it's harder than it looks, right? It looks like you could just hit the ball. No, that's not how it works. It's hard. Am I right? It's hard. Yeah. So let's say you're got a kid who's learning tennis or learning like a musical instrument, something where before you get good, you're going to suck at it for a long time. And if you're going to get there, you've got to struggle and struggle and struggle and struggle. And then finally, you start sounding good or you hit the ball right or whatever the thing is, right? So let's imagine that this child that you love so much and care about and would only want to help is learning this difficult task, right? Learning the instrument or the sport or whatever. And imagine, on one hand, this kid has a harsh, critical teacher. Maybe some of you have had teachers like this or coaches like this in your life. I hope not, but I hear they exist. So we can imagine how this critical teacher might relate to the child, right? The critical teacher thinks you just need to push him to keep going. So the critical teacher's like, no, not again. I don't even, what's wrong with you? It's not that hard. No, not like that, like that. Yeah, that's better. Keep going. There you go. No. What, are you stupid? Is there something wrong with you? No, not like that, like this. I don't know why I waste my time with you. Okay, so there's the critical teacher. Now, let's imagine, on the other hand, this child having a compassionate teacher. Now, let's imagine that this compassionate teacher has some different qualities that sort of enable them to be a compassionate teacher. Let's imagine first that the teacher is kind, which is to say the teacher isn't just concerned about teaching the task, but is concerned about the well-being of the child. Want the child to have a happy life, right? Doesn't want to traumatize them through the process. Imagine that this teacher is wise. The teacher understands that this is a difficult task and that if this child is going to get good at it, if they're going to improve, what they really need to do is to be able to motivate themselves to keep struggling. Right? The teacher understands that's how you get good at difficult tasks, by continuing to struggle, keeping going even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Right? That being able to keep doing that, that's the secret. Right? When you notice yourself struggling and not doing well, you keep going. You don't give up and go back to what you're good at already. You keep going. The teacher understands that. And let's imagine that this compassionate teacher is also confident. The teacher understands that if they can motivate the child to keep going, the child will improve. They will get better. If the child keeps struggling, keeps trying, keeps playing at the edge of what they can do, they'll get better. Right? So kind, wise, confident. We can imagine how this teacher might engage with the child, right? There you go. Keep going. I know it's tough, but you're doing great. Keep going. There you go. Not quite like that, more like that. Yeah, that's it. This is hard, but you're working at it anyway. Keep going. It's tough. It's going to be a struggle for a while, but there you go. This is hard for everybody. You got this. Keep going. So I'm going to ask you 2 stupid questions and maybe not one not so stupid question. And you can just answer by holding up 1 for teacher 1, 2 for teacher 2, right? Critical teacher, compassionate teacher. You got it? Okay. So stupid question number 1. Which teacher would you prefer this child that you love so much have? Seeing a lot of 2s, right? That's very nice. If you were holding up 1s, I'd be like, you might be at the wrong place. the mean teacher coach is up the road. Okay, so second question. Let's imagine that actually you don't have any sort of special relationship with this child, right? I mean, you don't particularly care about the child, except insofar as you care about the well-being of all children, but you don't have a special relationship or a special investment in the child. But let's say that for whatever reason, you do have an investment in the child learning the task, right? You really need a 3rd chair flautist or whatever, right? You need a striker on your soccer team or whatever it is. So you're invested that the child learn the task and get better. You want them to improve. So with that consideration in mind, again, 1 or 2, which teacher would you prefer the child have? Okay, lots of 2s here. That's good. That's good. We're on track. Now, 3rd question. When you notice yourself struggling in your life, which of those teachers does the voice in your head most sound like? We've got some 2s. Very nice. We've got some 1s. We've got some waverers, right? So what I find, and the basis of compassion-focused therapy really is that there are a lot of people who, when they ask themselves that question, it's a 1, right? Actually, compassion-focused therapy was developed by a British psychologist named Paul Gilbert, and actually he developed CFT after doing cognitive behavior therapy with a lot of depressed clients. And what he found is that although lots of the clients got better, there were several who did not. There were a certain group of patients who didn't seem to respond to the therapies that other people were responding to. They drugged the trials down too. So even if you looked at the research trials, if you looked within the CBT group, there would always be non-responders. And when he sort of unpacked that, when he would interview the clients to find out what was going on, he found that these were folks who had deeply seated shame convictions, right? They had a felt sense of knowing that there's something wrong with me. There's something bad about me. I'm not as good as other people, right? If you reflect on some of those attachment dynamics, we might even form hypotheses about how people might learn those things about themselves. But it turns out there are a lot of people out there who, when they struggle, when they're having a hard time, when they feel big feelings, whatever, they relate themselves with a level of harshness and sometimes cruelty that they would never express to another person. Right? They would never, any of you do that, ever say things to yourself that you would never say to another person when you're struggling? Why would you not say those to someone else? Yeah. Because you know it would hurt them. Right? So I came into compassion-focused therapy. There's this notion in psychology called self-compassion, which I was really reluctant to engage with for a while, because when I'd learned about compassion in Buddhist and other contexts, it was how I feel toward other people. Compassion, by the way, I think a lot of people out in the world, they hear compassion, they think, oh, compassion, right? They think it's just about being really nice. That's about sweet. And compassion, as you probably heard about compassion a little bit this week, maybe, yeah. In compassion-focused therapy, we define it, I think, in a way that's very consistent with the way Buddhist teachers do, which is sensitivity to suffering combined with a motivation to alleviate and prevent it, right? So it's sensitivity and motivation to help. And so if we think about it that way, the core of compassion actually is courage. It's this willingness to turn toward things that are uncomfortable or things that are scary or things that are painful, right? And if we look at many forms of what we would call mental illness and emotional difficulties that people have, there are sort of characteristic unhelpful patterns of relating to uncomfortable experience. So one unhelpful way that people will relate to difficult experiences is through avoidance. I'm just going to pretend that didn't happen. I'm just not going to think about that. I'm going to pull out my phone and lose myself in that and not engage with that. And what we find, if you haven't found this already, I hope you won't learn it through painful experience. When we avoid our problems, they don't go away. They go to the gym, right? They go and get bulked up so they can visit us more assertively the next time. Another unhelpful way of relating to difficult experience is through self-attacking and self-criticism. And shame, have you heard this term shame? Right? Sometimes people conflate shame and guilt and regret, but they're very different things, right? So guilt is sort of a painful emotional experience, but it takes the form of, I did this thing and I'm feeling bad that I did this thing, and so I want to do better. I want to make reparations. I want to apologize. I want to not do this thing again, right? So guilt, although tricky in some ways, can at least fuel reparative behavior, doing better, learning better ways to approach things like this. Shame, on the other hand, is when we do something or we behave a certain way or we get feedback, and the conclusion from us, or from, in the case of external shame, from others, is I did that and that means I'm a bad person. The fact that I did this means I'm bad, there's something wrong with me, I'm broken, whatever. And shame shuts people down. When we're in that place, when we're thinking this means that I'm bad, we just kind of shrink. And so compassion, on the other hand, in contrast to avoidance or self-attacking, is an entirely different way of working with suffering. And it has to do with how we relate to it, right? So instead of avoiding that we're uncomfortable, or saying, oh, the fact that I'm struggling with this means that I'm weak or stupid or not as good as or whatever, we can just sort of acknowledge, oh yeah, this is really painful. We can get curious about it, right? A lot of the Buddha's teachings really were about curiosity in relation to suffering and where it comes from. Why do we suffer? When do I suffer? Well, I suffer when I want something and I don't have it, and I suffer when I have something and I don't want it, right? And most of the things we suffer around is, some variation of that. But, compassion is about getting curious about the suffering, the causes and conditions that lead to it, and then going, given this, what would be helpful, right? Given this. So let's do another experiment, a little practice. It's not really a practice. I'm just going to ask you a couple questions, but you're learning that I'm long-winded, and this won't be an exception. Bring to mind, if you would, something you've struggled with in the last couple weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. Nothing like traumatic, right? We've all got those memories that if we really connect with them, it'll pull us out of the moment for the next hour or two, and we don't want to do that. But something, that you struggled with, something that you were having a hard time with, maybe a situation in which something happened and you were really confused, or you were feeling powerful emotions that were really uncomfortable, or maybe you reacted in a way that didn't really represent the version of you want to be. You said or did something that you reflect back on, you're like, not very proud of that moment. And you find yourself responding in a way that you wish you maybe had done differently. Does everyone have something like that, a struggle? Were you able to identify something like that? Yeah. So my question for you is, given what you know about you, like how you were raised, the things your caregivers gave you and taught you, the things they didn't give you and teach you, the different experiences you had in life, things you learned, things you didn't learn, the things that happened to you, like normal and traumatic, if there were any of those, just the things that happened in your life. Given the cultural messages you received about you and people like you, the messages you got about, what doors were open to you and which ones were closed, what you were capable of, what you weren't capable of, what you deserved and what you didn't, media representations of people like you. Given all of that, right, all of this stuff, like given the cultural context in which you exist now and historically, given all of that, everything you know about you and your life and how it's played out up until this point, does it make sense that you would struggle with that situation you brought to mind? Given everything you know about you, does it make sense that that would be hard for you? Or tricky, or confusing, or prompt difficult responses? How many of you are ever able to go, yeah, made sense? Was there any emotional experience associated with that acknowledgement? Like when you were able to go, yeah, it makes sense I would struggle with that. What was that like for you to just sort of name and acknowledge that?
Can I give the background? Okay. Can I give the background?
Sure.
Okay. One of my students, who I had been very close to up until like 4 weeks ago, part of my job is calling parents of Spanish-speaking families and giving like grade reports if they weren't able to make it for conferences. And the student and I have been very close for like the entire time that I've been at this job. And I gave a not so gracious grade report because she hasn't been coming to classes and she hasn't been doing the things that she needs to be doing to be on track to graduate. And she knew what it was about, and she was cussing at me through the phone while I was on the phone with her mother, and called me slurs.
The student was cursing at you.
Yeah. And came back to school and said that being gay is a sin and that I should not be a teacher for what I do. And it was really hard to like recognize that it was coming from a place of hurt and her own insecurity. And so like the emotional response I had is like, I didn't recognize up until this point that like that was like a deep-seated shame, I guess, that you kind of talked about. And so when you were like, does this make sense that this would be hard for you given your history and given like the context of you in the world, I was like, oh, there's like a peach pit in my intestine or something. It was just like a nodded reaction. So yeah, I don't know.
So your answer was yes. Yeah. So what was it? Don't give the mic away yet. So what was it like to say yes? When you said, oh yeah, that makes sense. Of course this would be hard for me. I got the pit. What was there any emotional experience that accompanied that awareness?
The immediate reaction was like, yes, it makes sense that I'm having a hard time with this. Yeah. So why am I being so hard on myself of like wanting to make reparations?
Yeah. So there was maybe a lightening of that tendency to beat yourself up over it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else have any sort of felt experience when you just made that acknowledgement? Oh yeah, that makes sense that I would struggle with that. It makes sense that would be hard for me, given all the things. The answer to that question, by the way, is always yes. Because causes and conditions, right? Right. The behaviorists will tell you, right? If it happens, that's why I struggle with things that, Brooke? No. Tell me your name. Yeah. Brooke. Yeah. I was scared that I didn't get it right. I struggle with things that Brooke doesn't struggle with, right? And Brooke struggles with things that other people probably don't struggle with. Yeah. Brooke, go ahead.
I also came to like, yes, that makes sense why I like struggle with it, but like I still think it doesn't like make what I feel right.
Yeah. So there's a sense that how I feel there are right ways to feel and there are not so right ways to feel, and I'm feeling not so right. Is that fair?
Just that like I don't have to feel that way. Like it doesn't have to be that way.
I wonder if there's a difference between those two things. I wonder if there's a difference between saying it's wrong that I feel this way, and maybe there are other ways I could work with this that would lead to me feeling differently. Do we see the difference here? So I would say this is more kind of leaning in the self-critical direction, and this is more the self-compassionate direction. In fact, I think compassion very often takes the form of curiosity, like, ouch, this is painful. Right? I can see how I'm responding to this. I'm wondering if there's something I could do to help respond a little differently. Right? And saying that it makes sense I responded doesn't mean, yeah, that's great that I did that. It's just understanding it in a context. Right? Thank you. Thank you. Any other thoughts, Brooke, before? No? Anyone else? What I often hear from folks when I ask that question, and we unpack it like this after, I often hear two things. The first thing I hear is kind of reminiscent of what you were saying, which was I felt like maybe a lessening of the tendency to be self-critical about how I react, right? Acknowledging, oh yes, of course I would react that way. That makes sense. It softened my tendency to attack. But that self-criticism was replaced with sadness. I often hear folks say, with that there was a sort of a sense of sadness that entered in, because very often when we acknowledge, yes, it makes sense I would struggle with this in the present, it's because we can identify an unmet need in the past, or something that happened to us that set us up to struggle, or whatever it was that we haven't dealt with that's still sort of echoing in the present in the form of these tricky situations. Does that make sense? But I can tell you, as a psychologist at least, I'm much more happy with sadness than I am self-attacking, right? Because we can work with sadness. We can work with the sad version of ourselves. But if your answer to why am I struggling is because I'm weak, what do you do with that? Right? That was a little more violent than I intended. There's a little give to the top of the table. I didn't mean to be quite so. So what I'd actually, if I leave you with anything today, and we've got a little more time together, I think, but it would be with maybe the invitation to carry this practice forward. That's the first question. And I would encourage you to bring this curiosity in your life as you go through your life from here, starting now, maybe until you die, right? And beyond that, if you like. When you see yourself struggling, if you can manage it, see if it's possible to pause and just ask, does it make sense that I would struggle with this? Right? That's the first question. After you've acknowledged, yes, it makes sense, because it always does. After you've answered that question, yes. The second question I'd encourage you to ask yourself is, given this, given that I'm struggling, given that I'm having a hard time with this, and it makes all the sense in the world that I would struggle with this, what would be helpful? Right? What would be helpful to do? And I want to name right now that sometimes people hear what would be helpful and they think, what would fix this problem? What would solve this? What would make it all better? And sometimes there are actual things we can do. When we ask the question, what would be helpful here? It would be helpful to do this, or to do that, or to intervene in this way. Sometimes that's the answer, and asking the question can lead us there, and that's great. I don't know about you, but for me, some of the things that I struggle with the most are things that in an immediate sense I can't change, right? Maybe in terms of the story arc of my life, I can join communities and contribute to improvement in these areas, but like in terms of what I can do right now in this moment, I can't really move the dial. Things like racism, sexism, climate change, whether or not I'll be living in a democracy in 9 months. These are things that trouble me greatly, And in an immediate sense, there's not a whole lot I can do about them, right? And we're all going to face situations like that in our lives. These uncontrollable situations, difficult periods of our life that at a baseline, we just have to survive, right? We have to find our way through this, moving through to the next thing, right? And so sometimes the answer to, given this, what would be helpful, isn't about changing the situation, or isn't exclusively about that, but it's about how do I help me be the best version of me while I engage with this really difficult situation. Does that make sense? How do I remain true to what's important to me? How do I be the best version of me while I struggle with this situation that I don't really have any help? I can't help struggling with it. This is the situation I'm in. This is what's on my table. This is the suffering that's sort of emerged at this point in my life, and it's my job to make it through that, right? And that could be a difficult work situation. It could be getting dumped by someone that you really love. It could be, there are all these things that happen in human life. That's part of the Buddha's message, right? To live is to suffer. If you're going to have a human life, stuff's going to go wrong sometimes. We're going to hurt. We're going to be uncomfortable. We're going to lose people we love. We're going to get sick, where all that stuff happens. Sometimes, I remember this particularly during allergy season, sometimes the answer to what would be helpful is, how do I be as comfortable as possible while I go through this really uncomfortable experience, right? Given that I know I'm in for a rough ride here, how do I stay as centered and as balanced as I can so I can respond in the way that best suits sort of where I am. So I just think I like those two questions because I think they contain the whole of compassion, right? Acknowledging I'm suffering makes sense. Understanding, considering the causes and conditions that contribute to the suffering. How does it make sense that I would be suffering? And then, given this, what would be helpful? What can I do? And sometimes what I can do is become a monastic, right? Sometimes what I can do is take a Zyrtec. So the other thing I think that's really important, and one of the reasons I'm actually so fond of Sravasti Abbey, is that there's an acknowledgement that while we're playing the long game in terms of preparing our minds in these various ways, that we also need to attend to pragmatic concerns too. There are things that we can actually do pragmatically in the moment right now that make a huge difference in terms of the qualities of people's lives and in terms of alleviating suffering in the here and now, right now. And I think the Abbey does a real good job of doing that, of keeping in mind that actually, while we're developing ourselves spiritually, what can we do? How do we engage with the world, with the community around us in ways that actually, in the moment, pragmatically have real effects too? So I think that balance is important too. But I also think that, as many of us, those of you who came here to get away from work maybe found out, it's very easy for our lives to turn into to-do lists, right? Where we're just going through, checking off that box and this box and that box and this box, and then going to bed and doing the same thing the next day. And years can pass if we let them, without us ever sort of pausing and going, well, what's really important to me? What do I really care about? What do I really want my life to be about? Like, what role do I want to play in the lives of the people I care about when I'm present, when I'm in a relationship with someone else? What do I want their experience to be? What do I want my presence to add into their lives or to take away from them? I think it's good to pause and ask ourselves those questions every so often, and then to kind of look at our lives and see, is what I'm doing on the day-to-day, is that reflecting the stuff I really care about? And I want to say, at the very least, for the benefit of the software engineers here, it's not just about what we do. It's about how we do it. Right? It almost doesn't matter the job. There are some jobs that create harm. And of course we should avoid those. Right? If you could say this job, I'm trying to I'm sort of happy that I'm not easily coming up with like overtly exploitive jobs. But if you have one of those, yeah, just stop that and do something else. But but for most of us, we're doing the thing, right? We're participating in this sort of system that we have in ways that help other people, that provide resources, that create something or wealth or whatever. But whatever the job is, it can be as much about how we do it as what we do, right? And how do we engage with the people that we work with? How do we impact them? Because every interaction we have, right, that we're impacting somebody else. Every time we engage with another human being, right? So I think it's useful to ask ourselves questions like, well, how do I want contact with me to impact the people around me? How do you want, this is an interesting one, I think, how do you want interactions with you to impact how the people around you feel about themselves? And of course, we can be intentionally naive about that if we choose, and we can say, well, that's none of my business, how you feel about yourself. I mean, that's your thing. I'm staying in my lane. But we know social psychologists have produced probably hundreds of studies that show that a big part of how we come to understand ourselves is how other people treat us, how other people interact with us, how other people engage with us, right? So when people treat us with kindness and respect and respond to us like they care what we're talking about, that communicates something to me about me. Over time, I come to learn, to experience myself as someone who's worthy of being treated kindly, someone who's worthy of respect, of being listened to, whatever, right? And if we're treated with disrespect, disregard, right, abuse, we learn to experience ourselves very differently. And if we look at the dynamics that exist within things like sexism and racism, you see that woven within. I'm much older than you. I just turned 53 this year. But I can tell you, when I was in school, when I was in elementary school and when I was in high school, all the girls I was in school with, not all of them, but most of them, believed that they weren't as good at math as the boys were. Because that was something when I was growing up that was just known. I don't even know where that notion came from. But it was in the culture, right? Girls aren't as good at math. Turns out that's complete bullshit. Literally, there's absolutely no truth to it. If you look at the most brilliant mathematicians in the world right now, a large percentage of those are women, right? But what happens is if you convey to people, yeah, this is something that's just true about you or about people like you, they sort of come to accept it. And their performance suffers as a result of it. There's actually something we talk about in psychology called stereotype threat. If you're a member of a historically stereotyped group, some of you are nodding, you've heard about it. If you're a member of a stereotyped group, right, and you've gotten messages that you're not good at this or you're not good at that, when you sit down to try it, it's harder for you. You're operating under a heightened level of threat because your awareness of the stereotype adds in cognitive load, because you're not just doing the task. You're thinking, am I gonna verify the stereotype? Am I gonna, right? So it's tricky stuff. The way we treat people shapes how they feel about themselves. I see it even in faculty meetings, right? In a psychology department. I mean, if you're going to be woke anywhere, right? Wouldn't it be a psycho? That's what all the right wingers say, right? All the woke the academics, right? But I remember I was in a faculty meeting a couple of years ago, right? And one of my female colleagues had made a comment. We were talking about some departmental issue, and she'd made this comment that I just thought was absolutely brilliant. And the conversation just moved on, right? She made the comment and the conversation kind of meandered on. So about 5 minutes later, I was like, I'll make up a name because I don't want to, if anyone sees this video. So I'll just say, well, I want to reiterate that point that Lisa made that I thought was so important. And then I restated the point. And people are like, oh yeah, that's pretty good. That's important. And then like 3 or 4 minutes later, one of my colleagues, I'll let you guess his gender. I guess I didn't work very well. Said, I agree with Russell. Yeah, that was a statement. I agree with Russell. Well, Russell hadn't said anything. Russell hadn't had any ideas that day. Right, but what did that communicate to Lisa? Right? So the way we engage with people matters in terms of not just how we impact them, but what we teach them about themselves. And I think it's just useful to think about these questions. I'm sorry, I'm meandering a bit today. I'm aware that it's my wife's birthday tomorrow. And I normally have lunch with you today, but she wasn't able to get her birthday off, so she took today off instead. So I had committed to this not knowing. So as soon as we're done here, I'm going to skedaddle back. So I'm sort of torn because I haven't gotten a card yet. And now that's on video. So so I thought one thing that I wanted to talk about that kind of comes from compassion-focused therapy, just because I think it might be useful for you in your lives, particularly those of you who, if you have emotions that you struggle with, I think it could be useful to sort of understand a little bit about how this stuff works. So we, in compassion-focused therapy, talk about emotions in terms of 3 emotion regulation systems, and it's organized by evolutionary function. So the 3 systems are threat, drive, and safeness and soothing. And so the idea is, if we think about what our ancestors had to do to survive and pass their genes along through the flow of life, right? There are things they had to do to survive. And for most of human history, our ancestors lived in a world that was much different than we live in today, where there were a lot of actually real physical threats, be they predators or lack of food or whatever, right? And so some of the core motives that we have within us that carry forward through sort of the human story, some of them are threat-based motives. They're around protecting ourselves, defending ourselves from threats. And so when we think about emotions like anger, anxiety, fear, disgust, these are all threat emotions. And they evolved. If we look through the lens of evolution, we have those emotions because they helped our ancestors survive in the face of a world filled with threat. Now, the reason I want to mention this is twofold. First, those are emotions that a lot of times people feel overwhelmed or shamed by, or think, I shouldn't feel this, this is bad, this is wrong. Well, it turns out you have structures in your brain that exist largely to trigger those emotions. We call that the threat system. And the idea is when you're feeling anxiety or fear or anger, right, that's your brain having registered the threat, trying to protect you. Right? Something's bad. We need to meet the challenge. Now, the tricky bit about that is that when that happens, when fear or anxiety or anger comes up, some really powerful stuff happens with the way we process information. A lot of times when we say emotion, people think how I feel. And that's one part of it. Part of an emotion is how I feel. But part of an emotional experience like anger or fear or anxiety involves a lot more than just how I feel. It shapes our attention, what we pay attention to, and how broadly or narrowly our attention is, as well as how easy it is to shift our attention, to move it about where we want it. It affects our thinking and reasoning by either narrowing or expanding our ability to think and focusing it on, in this case, the threat, right? So how we feel affects our imagery, our mental imagery, right? The words and the movies and pictures that play out in our minds. It affects our motivation, what we want to do, and our behavior, how we tend to behave. So when an emotion like anger comes up, all of that stuff kind of falls into play. It's like an algorithm, right? You punch in anger on the jukebox and all this stuff comes into play. And so, have you learned, probably you don't go into emptiness too much in Young Adults Week, do you? We have a little. A little? Okay. So I really like the Gelugpa approach to emptiness. So this idea that things don't have inherent existence, right? So from a Buddhist perspective, or from a Gelugpa perspective, this is so arrogant. I'm just going to reference emptiness teachings in like 30 seconds. And I'm going to capture those, right? Like I can do that. But from this perspective, when we say that something empty, the question is, what is it empty of, right? What is it empty of? And so when from a Buddhist perspective, if I say this cup is empty, what it's empty of is what we might say inherent or intrinsic existence, right? It currently functions as a cup, but it doesn't really, this is such a fun way of languaging it, doesn't really have any inherent cupness, right? If a Buddhist were to say, what does it mean to have inherent existence? What it means is you're only that thing, right? So if this had inherent existence as a cup, it would only be a cup. It would only have ever been a cup. It would only ever be a cup. It would never be anything other than a cup. Does that make sense? And so when I say this cup doesn't have any inherent existence, what I mean is it hasn't always been a cup. It won't always be a cup, right? Right now, all the causes and conditions that have to do with the matter in this cup have convoluted and come together so that in this moment it appears and functions as a cup. So although it doesn't have inherent existence, we may say it has conventional existence. Conventional existence means it appears like this right now and it functions like this in this moment right now. So I can drink. Right? Well, that was a little melodramatic, wasn't it? So the reason those notions for me were really helpful in understanding the concept of emptiness, because it's like, oh yeah, I can get that, right? So maybe I shouldn't be so attached to my car because in 2 years it's going to be a beat up piece of crap, right? Right. Anyway, that's my kind of a low-level application there. The reason I'm invoking these concepts of like emptiness and things like this is that I think a lot of times when people say me, we say it with a sense that somewhere there's a self to be found. There's a version of the self that's true and real and solid. And I think if I can only find that, and if I can't find it, then people get really worked up. I don't know myself. I can't find myself. And there are even models of psychotherapy that sort of have this idea that you have this true self, and our job is to really uncover it. Compassion-focused therapy isn't like that at all. If pushed to say what's the inherent self that all beings have, we'd probably talk about it the way Buddhists talk about it. It's the quality of awareness, right? It's that part of me that kind of experiences reality unfolding as it unfolds. But in a really inherent sense, that's what there is. But we would talk, I don't use the word conventional selves because that's more a Buddhist term. I would say we have an infinite version almost of what we might call functional selves. And when I say a functional self, it's kind of like all the matter in this cup in this moment takes the form of this cup and it functions as a cup. Well, when a basic motive or emotion gets lit up in our minds, what happens is all those different things we do, attention, thinking and reasoning, imagery, motivation, behavior, felt experience tends to fall in line. And what you get is an angry version of me, or a depressed version, or a compassionate version, or a loving version, or an excited version. Think about that, right? Have you ever had times in your life where maybe you were having a really hard time or you were overcome with emotion and you behaved in a way that when you reflect back on it now, you can almost not even believe that was you that did that? Like, that's so far from the person I want to be. So the idea here is these different experiences powerfully organize these motives and emotions, powerfully organize our mental experience in ways that can either move us closer to sort of the lives we want to have, or move us further away. And the extent to which we understand this, we can have a little more choice around how it all plays out, versus being a pinball that's just bounced from motive to motive depending on sort of what's happening in our lives, right? So, for example, when threat emotions like anger, anxiety, or fear come up, there are characteristic patterns of attention and thinking and reasoning that show up. So, for example, have you noticed, like, when you're feeling threatened, your attention's like, and it's focused on whatever the threat is? Have you ever had that experience where something was going rough in your relationship, or whatever your life situation was? You were trying to, I'm aware this young adults week, so maybe not so much, but maybe some of you, you were trying to close on a house, and then when you're buying your first home, and then something flubbed it up and it didn't work, right? Or you're Gen Z living in Seattle, and you look at the home prices and realize you'll never be able to afford a home, right? I'm sorry. And by the way, generationally, I'm so sorry. It's horrible. It really is. This is a problem we must solve. But have you ever noticed, you go to work or you go to school and you're trying to concentrate on that thing, on what you're doing, but you keep going back. Your mind keeps going back to the threat, to the relationship, to whatever, right? That's your threat system doing exactly what it's designed to do. Your threat system evolved to help you deal with bears, right? If you're walking in the forest and there's a bear, you want to be focused on the bear. You don't want to be distracted by the beautiful flowers. That's how you get eaten, right? And so when these threat emotions come up, the reason they're so tricky, the reason they're so problematic, the reason in Buddhist practice there's a lot of focus on how do we work with these, is that when those emotions come up, they focus us in a way that make it really hard to be the best versions of ourselves, because they narrow our attention, they narrow our thinking and reasoning. Critical thinking falls offline. Empathy falls offline. And it's not our fault. Those emotions are designed to focus us on the threat so we can deal with those. They're designed to be time limited. Wrap it on, wrap it off. Trouble is, we live in a culture now where there are threat stimuli constantly. Because we can get people to do things, right? If I threaten you, if I get you to feel unsafe, then I can give you a solution, right? Your lives, reflect on it. Your life isn't the way you'd want it, is it? Sometimes you feel unfulfilled. Sometimes you hit it home and you wonder what it all means. But if you buy this nice cup, you'll feel ever so much better, right? Candidate X hates your way of life and will destroy you. But if you vote for candidate Y, everything will be better, right? So getting people to feel threatened focuses them and helps prime them for behavior. This is why, by the way, arguing doesn't work, the way threat organizes the mind. Have you ever had an argument with someone or witnessed an argument where one person on one side has all the data, they have all the evidence, they are objectively right to the nth degree, and they get in an argument with the other person, and there's no movement. In fact, at the end, the other person seems more dug in to where they were than to begin with, right? It's because if I'm having a conversation with you and I engage with you in a way that triggers threat in you, you're going to go, and your whole focus of your being is around defending. And what are you defending against? Me and my data. So when we argue with people, not only are we not going to win them over with our superior reasoning or our evidence, but we're almost certainly going to encourage them to dig in more deeply to their existing position, because we're forcing them to defend it. Much better to engage curiously. Help me understand. I mean, you have a very different perspective on this than I do. Help me understand where you're coming from, because I look at that candidate, I just don't get it. What is it that help me understand how this makes sense to you? Right? And then maybe if I listen and I make some reflections that communicate that I'm actually hearing you and I'm understanding what you're saying, maybe that person would be curious to hear what I think about it. Maybe that'll work, maybe it won't. But I know triggering threat in them won't, because when our threat systems kick in, right? The second So that's the way those threat emotions. The thing that I want you to take away is those emotions, by the way, they're not your fault when they come up. Anger, fear, anxiety. That's not something that's wrong with you. That's actually your brain having registered a threat or a block to your goal, trying to protect you. But they play out in ways that are very narrowing and make it hard for you to think flexibly, creatively, or empathically. Yes?
So you're saying how like our culture, like people feel threatened all the time, and we're constantly with that narrow focus. What does that happen? Like what happens if it's like that for an extended period of time?
Well, lots of bad things. So, for example, studies show that people with chronic hostility die 7 years younger than other people. So there are healthcare problems, but it affects how we interact too, right? If I'm in threat all the time, how am I going to engage with other people? How am I going to drive, right? What am I going to do at the end of the day, right? So why would we do this? Why would we create a culture like this? Well, it probably drives up alcohol sales, right? Why do people think, we've talked about Oklahoma, right? Why does everyone I grow up with have like an arsenal at home? Right? Like they don't just have an AR-15, they have a collection of AR-15s. And when I ask them, why do you need so many guns? They say, well, got to protect my family. Have you ever had to use one of your guns to protect your family? Well, no, but it could happen anytime. Do you know anyone that's ever had to use any of their guns to protect their family? I mean, you do know from people, oh, all my friends have guns. Do you ever know anyone? No, I don't, but it could happen at any time. You know anyone who's had a family member harmed by a gun accident at the house? Well, yeah, I mean, there was, it doesn't get, but see, threat, right? So I think there are lots of consequences, most of them negative, in terms of people being in threat all the time. And I think that's actually why we need to think about these cultural dynamics, right? Because the other thing that happens when people are in threat all the time, and perhaps the most tricky part, is we get really selfish. And I want to say it's not our fault that we do that, right? The defensive motives, our brains are biased towards attending to, if I'm threatened, right, I got to keep myself safe. So the moment someone gets threatened, it becomes that much harder for them to think about other people, for them to think about the consequences of their actions, things like this. The second system is the drive system, right? The other thing, our ancestors, in addition to needing to defend themselves from threats, they needed food, resources, social position that granted mating opportunities, right? We need to acknowledge, I mean, we are the way we are because the way we are allowed our ancestors to survive. And evolution doesn't care so much about human happiness, except as our happiness sort of is parallel to the furthering of our genes, right? I suspect the reason most human beings find sex fun and interesting is that, the ancestors we had who didn't find sex fun and interesting didn't have it and didn't further their genes through the flow of life, right? So we're all the progeny of the horny ones. So the idea is we have these emotions that focus us. We get excitement. I mean, notice when we think of the drive system, excitement, engagement, motivation, ambition, right? Anytime you're like, ooh, I want that, right? That's your drive system kicking in. And what happens when those emotions show up is there's a similar sort of thing we see in threat. There's a dramatic narrowing of attention, thinking, and reasoning. I want that. How do I get that? Moving towards it. Right. Now, this can be useful if it's a helpful goal, right? If we're working towards something we want, we need that motivation to keep us working even when it's hard, to keep going. That's good. But the drive system, we can also get so caught up in it that we miss out on other things because that narrowing blinds us to other considerations. I wonder how many children out there have unavailable parents because the parent is so into their job that they're just not emotionally, there's nothing left when they come home. I'm convinced actually that a whole lot of the harm that happens in the world isn't due to people who get up in the morning saying, I'm going to go out and hurt people today. But it's people who are pursuing their goals with such fervence that they just don't consider the potential consequences of doing that, right? I maybe I'm being too charitable, but I don't think Jeff Bezos, when he created Amazon, I don't think he said, I want to go out there and put thousands of independent bookshops out of business. I want to devastate the landscape of book and record stores. I don't suspect he thought about that at all. I think he just wanted to create a successful online business and succeeded really well. But when enough people buy their books and records online, independently owned shops disappear. It's just what happens. And so I think that when we think about drive and threat, right, there's a narrowing. It focuses us and narrows us on the goal and motivates us to pursue those, which is why we need the third system, right? This third system, this third set of emotions we have are very different. We call it the safeness system. Safeness is kind of a weird made-up word, right? You probably haven't heard the word safeness much. You may have heard the word safety. We use safeness because safety is about threat regulation. Safety is about feeling less scared, less vulnerable, less whatever. Safeness is about feeling safe. Bring to mind, have you had a situation where, hopefully some this week, where you've just been a really pleasant situation, you're with people that care about you, there's no threats, there's nothing really that you have to do, you're just enjoying yourselves, maybe having a little bit of something to drink or something to eat and having a pleasant conversation and just really like gosh, why can't it always be like this? You know what I'm talking about? Have you had those experiences? Right? That's what I mean when I say safeness. Calm, content, and soothed, safe. And for human beings, we really evolved for those experiences to occur through connection. Right? Connection with other humans. But it doesn't have to be humans. I've snuggled with my dogs more since the pandemic because it's soothing. Right? We get those chemicals like oxytocin kind of flowing in our brains. We feel safer. But one fundamental message, by the way, of compassion-focused therapy as well is that human brains are tricky things, right? And one example of that is oxytocin. How many of you have heard of oxytocin, right? So when you think oxytocin, what do you think of? Cuddling, hugging, feeling safe, connected, pair bonding, right? Is that what you think of? For a while, when they studied this, they first started studying oxytocin and nursing mothers, actually, and they noticed when nursing moms, when the child would be breastfed, there would be massive amounts of oxytocin released in the brain of both the mother and the child, and that facilitated bonding and connection. And then they started observing it in other sorts of relational contexts. And there were even people saying, you know what we really need to do if we want to get away from all the wars and things like this is just give all the men oxytocin gum. They have this oxytocin gum. They do. They have gums. You can, I don't know where to get it. I should go on Amazon. But they actually did a study. One of my favorites is they got a group of men and women together and had them watch like romantic comedies, like traditional chick flicks. With the prediction, of course, is that the women will watch it and maybe get a little more teary than the guys. The reverse happens in my relationship, by the way. My wife's very staunch, so we'll be watching it, and I'll be, she's like, what? But what they did is they saw the predicted thing, right? The women became more emotional than men, unless you gave the men oxytocin gum. And if the men were given oxytocin as the gum, they were as weepy as the women were. So anyway, they thought, well, maybe this could be the secret. Maybe we could use oxytocin. But it turns out that even the way our brains help us feel safe is tricky. When we get a rush of oxytocin, a release of oxytocin in the brain, we feel closer, but we only feel closer to our people, right? And if there's an identified out group, if there's a them, even when oxytocin is released, even as I feel closer to my people, I become more skeptical and suspicious of the out group. How screwed up is that? Even the chemicals that help us feel safe drive wedges between us if there's a them, if there's a they, if there's an undesirable people, if there's an out group. Does that make sense? Now, as the Dalai Lama will remind you, we have these fancy human brains that allow us to do things like focus on the common elements between us while valuing the differences and cherishing them as contributing meaningfully, right? And to the extent we do that, we can extend us to everybody so that the way we feel safe doesn't exclude people. But if we don't do that, there'll be an us and a them, and even the stuff that brings us together drives us apart from them. That made a lot of sense when humans lived in these small, isolated villages that competed for natural resources, right? And if they survived, it meant often we won't. That's probably why, for example, things like racism are anchored to visual cues, right? Because if my biology is designed to distinguish us, them, visual cues allow me to do that at distance. So I guess one part of the CFT story is if we understand the tricky ways our brains evolved, they can help us bring compassion to how we work, right? So we can keep from falling into the shame of, oh, this is just bad, I'm just bad, and instead go, oh yeah, this completely makes sense, right? So for example, do you any of you ever wish that you could crave broccoli the way you crave pizza or chips or tater tots? Anyone? Yeah, a few of you. Some of you are like, no. Any people are like, I totally do. I love broccoli that much. I bow to you. Teach me your ways. I mean, it's crazy, right? That so many of us would crave and be genuinely like soothed in the moment by experience of eating sugary, fatty, salty foods that if we have too much, they'll kill us, right? Isn't that screwed up that those would be the foods that would comfort us? But if we reflect back on human history, right, we live, those of us in this culture right now here, live in a culture in which food is abundant, particularly fatty, salty, sugary foods, right? Tend to be pretty expensive. It tends to be abundant. And that's not true for everybody in the world, but it's true probably for most of us in this room, hopefully. Our brains didn't evolve to deal with abundance. They evolved to help us stay alive in situations of scarcity, when you didn't know when the next meal was coming from, when you didn't know if you'd have food next week. And in a world of scarcity, fat is caloric storage that can help me survive next week if I don't get an elk. Sugar is immediate energy, and salt is an essential nutrient that's found relatively rarely in the natural world. Right? So did it make sense for our ancestors that if they were to encounter food, sugar, and salt, that they would want to eat as much of that as they could? That they would feel cravings around that? Of course. So our brains are tricky, and in some ways they're better suited to earlier times in the human story. But I guess I'm seeing I'm over time. So I'll just sort of end by emphasizing the safeness system. And this is why Sangha is so important. This is why connection is so important. This is why working with our emotions is so important. Because when we feel safe, and we evolved to do this through connection, and if our attachment history has gone the way it should, we will feel soothed through connection. Now, part of the reason I'm a psychotherapist is I have a lot of people who don't feel that way. That's why the therapeutic relationship is most important. The techniques we use in therapy, important, but less important than whether or not the client feels connected, safe, understood, cared about. Studies show that year after year after year. Why? Because when we feel safe, that narrow focus of threat and drive, I want to fight that off, or I need to fight that off, or I want that, opens. And we become reflective. We're able to turn ideas around in our minds. We're able to empathize. We're able to mentalize. Have you heard this term mentalization? Mentalizing means when I see someone else behaving a certain way, I ask, how does it make sense that they would behave that way? What's going on in their mind? How are they making sense of this? How are they interpreting this? What need are they trying to meet? What goal are they trying to pursue that would help me understand why they're behaving in that way? Right? And other people's behavior makes a whole lot more sense when we can mentalize. But we don't tend to do that when we're in threat. And we don't tend to do that when we're chasing after my goal. Right? We do that when we feel safe and things open up. So our ability to do that, to create contexts in which we can soften a little bit, right? and give ourselves a moment to think, okay, what do I really care about in this situation? What's really going on? Right? What do I want to do? That sets us up to be the version of ourselves we want to do. And understanding the dynamics of threat, well, if you're someone who interacts with yourself in ways that fuel your own sense of threat, right? When we shame ourselves, when we attack ourselves because we're feeling this way, or because we've just done something that we're not proud of, or because we're confused, when we say that's something that's wrong with me, that's something that's bad about me, what we do is we're narrowing ourselves on the threat. Right? I teach statistics to psychology majors for 25 years. And about 2/3 of my students come in, they're terrified. And if, they're the kind of people that if they felt completely safe or a little uninhibited, they might say something like, I've never really been good at math. They're scared of it. They're convinced they can't do it. Usually because they've had a bad math teacher at some point. They've had a math teacher that when they didn't get it, made them feel like there was something that was wrong. I don't know why you're not understanding this. Everyone else seems to be. Teachers actually say that. It's like the worst thing a teacher could say. So they got this idea that I'm not good at this, right? But what I found is that if I can help those students feel safe, right, suddenly, and have some patience with the idea that I don't understand now doesn't mean I cannot understand. Doesn't mean I will never understand. It means I don't understand yet. So what can I keep going? So in the classroom, in the therapy room, I'm shooting for drive and safeness. I want interested, excited, engaged, safe, reflective, flexible. So as you go through life, I would encourage you to try and notice, like when you're going into threat, maybe pause and ask, gosh, does it make sense that this would be hard for me? Given what I know about me, does it make sense that I would struggle? And then consider what might be helpful in working with that. And very often, what might be helpful in working with that is, can I help move myself into safeness? What would help me feel a little safer? What would help me slow down so I could open up and kind of be the best version of me? And that's where a lot of these meditation practices can come in very helpful. That's where just slowing down your breath, like just slowing your breath down. I think breathing apps can be nice because you don't have to worry about a count. You can just breathe along to the balloon expanding or contracting, right? It just slowing things down and pulling back from the thread a little bit, and then giving yourself some space to be a little more reflective, feel a little safer. So I've talked beyond my time allotment. Are there any questions or things like this? Yeah. Usually what often happens, I come and I talk for a while, and then we take a brief break, and then we have a discussion up until lunch. So do you need a break, or do we want to? No? Okay. There's a question. Go ahead.
You were talking about the 3 systems, and I believe I've read somewhere that you cannot feel gratitude and stress at the same time. Is that true? It might be like internet. The other is, for the 3 systems, is it also true that maybe only one system activates at a time? And so if you feel safe, your threat system deactivates? Yeah. I'm curious.
Those are related questions. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Take care. So the answer to those questions is actually closely related, in that the first question was, is it possible to feel gratitude and stress at the same time? And the answer is absolutely. Absolutely. There very often we experience some of this, some of that, some of this. Have you heard of mindfulness? Right, you've heard of mindfulness. So I'm going to do, I think a lot of times mindfulness is taught as a practice that we do on the cushion, slowing down, focusing on the breath. There's a saying actually we use in CFT, which I think was actually stolen from a Buddhist teacher. Well, I don't know the teacher. I've only heard it from Paul Gilbert. but I like it very much. The saying is, the finger that points at the moon is not the moon. And the idea is that in psychology, where I come from, the finger that points at the moon, that's the technique, that's the practice, that's the strategy, that's the meditation, that's whatever we're doing. And the moon is, what's the psychological process I'm trying to get moving? What am I trying to target, right? And so if the moon, right, if the process I'm targeting is present moment awareness of what you're feeling, which is kind of a mindfulness outcome, I might suggest to you that, one thing you could do 2-3 times a day is just pause and ask, which one of those three systems is in the foreground for me right now? Which one of those three systems is running the show? Or if you wanted to recognize how they blend, you might think, okay, I'm going to rate those three systems from 0 to 10 based on how active they are. So for example, right now, my threat is like a 1 or a 2, right? It's very low. I don't even know. I'd give it a 0, but then I'd probably be asleep. And I'd put my drive up about 5 or 6. I'm excited to be here, to be talking with you. And I'd put my safeness at 7 or 8 because this is a very comfortable place for me. I cherish time at the Abbey and I love coming here. I guess my 2 threat is frustration that I can't stay for lunch. But so you can feel different things at once. I would argue that's why certain parts of our lives are trickier than others. I think romantic relationships, one of the reasons they can be so maddening is all three systems are going, right? Drive is going, right? Both in terms of, I want this person, I love this person, I'm attracted to this person. There's threat. What if they don't like me? What if they break up with me? What if this doesn't work? What if it doesn't work, right? And then hopefully there's some safeness. Like when I'm with them, I have moments of feeling just safe and connected and cherished. And all of that stuff's going at once, right? It's tricky. So yeah, I think we can feel lots of different things at once. And I think what's even trickier is that we can have feelings about other feelings. So for example, in the workbook, which I think is pretentiously titled The Anger Workbook. What is that about? The publishers. But anyway, one of the things I included in there was the way these can interact. So for example, we've got some folks who struggle with anger, but they don't look like angry people because they're not acting out angrily. They actually look like people who tend to look a little more passive, because what happens is they learn that you must not be angry. You must never behave angrily. And if we're taught that you can never express anger, it doesn't take us long to figure out maybe there's something bad about even feeling it. And so there are some people that they notice the feeling of anger and then boom, I feel anxious because I'm doing something wrong. Right? So we can have emotions about other emotions. I did anger groups in a prison at Airway Heights outside Spokane. And when we would get into anxiety and sadness, the guys in the groups would say, no, I don't go there. I use anger to not feel that. So we can have blends of emotions. Yeah, it can be very complicated. Good question. Other questions? Thoughts, humorous anecdotes?
This is completely unrelated to what you just talked about. Also, if anyone has a question, please take over. Which is, what do you think about reincarnation?
What do I think about reincarnation?
Because the whole brain stuff.
Yeah. I don't have a problem with the brain in relation to rebirth. I will say that at this point in my life, I do not personally believe in reincarnation. I want to make it very clear, I am not saying that reincarnation is not a thing and it doesn't happen. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that as someone who has a more sort of scientific leanings, I don't understand a mechanism for it that I can explain, right? And I've never been good at accepting, or choosing to believe things. So mechanistically, I have a hard time making sense of that. I'm wrong about a lot of stuff, and I think there's a fair possibility that I'm wrong. If you ask me what happens after you die, I'm likely to say, well, I mean, who the hell knows? That's kind of my standpoint on that. I don't have any strong conviction about that. But at this point, I would say that for me, I will say it's fair to say, I think the relevance of the question for me is that I'm not counting on something happening after I die. So for me, the question is, what do I do now so that my life has some kind of meaning, or contributes to the good in some way? Those are the things that motivate me. I get sometimes similar questions when I'm in Christian circles. Christian circles will sometimes say, would you believe in heaven and hell, things like that? And I say, well, no, I don't, for the same reason. And if I'm wrong, and there is a God and there's all that, then I'm hoping that God will say, well, you didn't believe in me, but I'm going to give you a pass because you did some good stuff. And so, and I guess what I'm saying is, if around rebirth, if rebirth is a thing, and it's a thing that's informed and shaped, that part of the causes and conditions that predict the conditions of our rebirth are how we lived our lives, the seeds we planted here, that, belief or not, I want to live in such a way that I would have a favorable rebirth. Does that make sense? So that's kind of where I'm at with that. But don't not believe it because of me. All right, I'm a scientist, and so for me, I've got to have the mechanism. Tough question, but thanks for it. Yeah, I think, we need to be honest about things. Yeah.
So I know that we've been talking about attachment theory.
Mm-hmm.
And my question to you is, first coming here, I'm talking about attachment theory from the, psychology perspective. I first came here and I was like, are all monks kind of avoidantly attached? Because they're like, detached. I was like,
no.
This is like a group of people. So, humorously, like, what is your perspective on that? How can you seek being detached all the time and not be like avoidantly attached?
I have to say, I don't experience monastics as detached at all. I mean, I will say, almost to a person, the monastics and the Buddhists I know are warm, caring, loving people. I think that the detachment around attachment, if we're going to apply that into the interpersonal realm, I think what's different is that I think in a secular sense, like, I'm attached to my wife in both an attachment style sort of attachment, but also in a kind of a Buddhist attachment sort of way. Does that make sense? So it's not, I don't claim ownership or something, but this is kind of my person, right? And so let's say that she had an affair with another man. That would be devastating to me, right? So there's both. There's, I feel connected and I feel soothed through connection, but there's also not an ownership, but you know what I'm saying? A clinging, and therefore you owe me something, or there's like some sort of relational contract that is binding in such a way. And I think that it can actually be problematic. I think it can be really tricky for people in lots of ways. And it means that if she gets to a point in her life where she's decided that I'm not her person anymore, that for whatever reason, she wants to become a monastic, she wants to do whatever, that would be really hurtful for me. There'd be a lot of loss around that. So I think what you're calling detachment, in some ways, I think for a Buddhist monastic is, I'm not going to place conditions around love and connection that are based on these individualized sort of connections. But I haven't experienced that as a lack of warmth, or a lack of kindness, or a lack of like interpersonal genuineness. I can say I don't know any monastics that I would call detached in an avoidant attachment sort of, I don't care about other people sort of way. I think actually being a monastic is hard. It's hard. And I think if you didn't care about people, if you didn't really care about people, if you didn't care about people so much that you were going to devote your life to alleviating the suffering of every one of them, you wouldn't do that. Avoidantly attached people
would not become monastics. They wouldn't. It's love that drives that. It's not detachment.
Thank you for that. Sorry to press you after such
Press
an
me.
emotional. Would you further say, this is a lighter question, but
I'm easily moved, by the way. This isn't a momentous experience for me. When two students are walking in the halls of Eastern Washington University, and one of them says, "Oh, I got a Colts class this quarter," the next one's probably likely, the next sentence out of their mouth is, "Well, has he cried yet?" I'm easily moved. It's just me.
have you been chewing some oxytocin gum?
Oh gosh, that would wreck me, wouldn't it? All right, I'd just be this quivering bowl of jelly.
So my follow-up was originally going to be, would you then say that part of the monastic practice is the monastic's practice being securely attached?
I think secure attachment is woven into the monastic life in some ways. I think that the notion of Sangha is very much around embedding people, because again, to be a monastic is really hard, right? It requires you give up a lot of stuff that's pleasant and fun. You work really hard. You learn these practices that actually take a lot of mental effort and a lot of physical effort. You do a lot of these things. And I think one of the things that's really brilliant about Buddhism is it recognizes that it is hard, and if people are going to be able to succeed in doing something that difficult, they need connection and support. So because it's a lot easier, we're doing something hard together versus me doing something hard for me, right? So I think that's embedded within Sangha. But I also think that when you spend your life doing these things, it can set you up to engage in ways that are kind with other people. And I think actually the emphasis on equanimity is really important, because if equanimity is really about, I'm not going to pick out one person as special and that's going to be my person. I'm going to extend myself lovingly to everybody. And when you're in a monastic environment, that means everyone is extending themselves lovingly to you because you're part of everybody. And so that's the sort of safeness of secure attachment. So I think, I don't know actually if anyone in the Buddhist world have ever thought about it like that, but they've certainly thought about how do we create an environment that supports people's ability to do this work. And I think it's probably because to be able to do the sort of work around spiritual liberation that you have to do as a monastic, you have to be able to think flexibly. You have to be able to be empathic. And we can only do that when we're safe. So I think that evolved, not in a biological way, but in a cultural way, a way of a Buddhist social structure that supports that. It has to support secure attachment for monastics to do the mental work that they have to do to be effective monastics. Now, I'm sure that that's almost certainly not universal, because we're talking about human beings. So there are probably some monastics that are very ambitious and very about, let me establish me in this way. And I think it's so easy for us to slip into those modes of being. But the other thing about Sangha that's very supportive of that too is that part of what that does is it gives people a chance to give us a reality check, right? When there are people who care about me, they can come to me and say, hey, can I talk to you about something? I've been noticing some things here. And there's enough humbling experiences that we tend not to maybe get so full. I said ourselves. I'm not a monastic, so I shouldn't say it like that. But you know what I'm saying. So I think, yes, I think it's built in. I don't know if it's intentional around attachment, because attachment is a psychology term that we talk about in psychology, but certainly it's functioned in exactly that way. Great question. Great question.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you might be able to share some strategies that I could bring back to coworkers who are working in an environment where maybe their manager is using a strategy of overloading them so that to trigger a stress response and create them to work maybe harder, faster, longer hours. was wondering how to support them in that situation, because the way that I go about it currently is I just try and remind them that you can only do what you can do in a day, like you're only one human, and kind of help to make them aware of the amount of pressure that they're putting on themselves and how it's not realistic or sustainable. I was wondering if you had any other.
I'm assuming there's no way to intervene with the system that's placing them in that situation.
Well, at one of the places, I would say no.
So you work at an Amazon fulfillment center? No,
I'm sorry. I do work at part-time at Whole Foods, which is Amazon.
Yeah. It's very much like that. So I guess this is interesting. This is the kind of thing we talk about in psychology all the time. It's not in quite the same ways, because some therapists are overburdened like that. But a lot of times it's around just, when you meet with 7 clients a day and you're hearing trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, these sorts of things can be very tricky. So there are lots of situations like that. I think first off, if the culture of the place can be changed, I would get curious about that, because there are corporations and companies that do a better job of that, because they've learned that when you push people the way you're describing, people end up calling out a lot more. They end up taking more sick days. Productivity actually ultimately suffers. But assuming you can't do that, what I would want to do is encourage people outside work to do things that are really nurturing, that are helpful in terms of, everything from the basics that we know create better human lives: regular exercise, sleeping 7-8 hours a night, moving, or eating healthily. I mean, those are really important. And then nurturing social situations, doing stuff that's meaningful, having hobbies, things they love, those sorts of things. I know for me, as a psychologist, and I'm not a full-time psychotherapist. I'm mostly a professor, but I do a lot of supervision, and I've done some psychotherapy, and I always have some clients going. It's a side hustle, so I don't have a lot of room in my life for that. But for me, it's not about how do I not take that home? How do I manage this difficulty here? It's not about threat regulation. It's about creating stuff in my life that is soothing and gives my life meaning and is fun and involves connection with people that I care about. So when I'm leaving that job, I'm not running away from something aversive. I'm running toward something that's really fulfilling. And I think that if we have that, what it can do is it could help us put this stuff into context. So even if it's hard, maybe we take it a little less seriously, because we realize, this is how I'm paying my bills, but there's the stuff I really care about, right? And it's still rough, but maybe it alleviates it. But the point is, there's no easy answer. There's no, just give them this breathing technique and everything will be fine, because that's a work environment that's almost designed to keep them in threat. So what we want to do is help them develop lives that help them as soon as possible go, And the other thing I would do is look and see if there are any structural things I could do at the workplace. Even things like readily available, tasty, healthy snacks, a comfortable workplace, break room, just anything where they, can have something that breaks the thread up. Those are the kind of pragmatic things I would say. That's tricky. Good question.